This game marks a big tonal shift in the franchise. Looking back on the previous World War II cards, you clearly notice the themes of bravery and heroism. That's completely absent in this game. This game is violent and unapologetic. War has never been this fucking scary in any game up to this point. It also takes a step back from being overly cinematic, which, together with the raw grittiness, grounds it in reality. You follow the Americans in the Pacific and the Soviets on the Eastern Front. Both of these sides have wildly different themes and huge tonal differences. You will be left disgusted and horrified. COD 4 already had a bit of that horrors of war tone, but here it's really taken to the extreme. We have now reached the edgy teen phase. This, like I said, is where COD moves away from the themes of courage and bravery and emphasize the absolute horror that war is. This, along with COD 4, feels like a direct response to the themes of the first three. Treyarch really finds their identity with this game, and a rivalry between Infinity Ward and Treyarch begins. Over the last 4 videos, we've looked at Call of Duty's growth as a franchise. What started as a small team wanting to give their take on World War II quickly turned into a huge mainstream success. The games used their platform to praise the bravery of the people that took part in World War II. This quickly changed with the 4th entry. Set in modern day, we got a darker, grittier, and more serious portrayal of war. This, together with the addictive multiplayer, cemented COD in the direction it would go. Infinity Ward has now made their entry, and the ball is in Treyarch's court. How will they respond to the absolute success that was COD 4? On December 2nd, 2007, it was announced that Treyarch had begun developing the next installment of the Call of Duty series. Fans wouldn't hear anything about it again until the 21st of June 2008, where the first trailer was dropped. This was shortly followed by the game's announcement on the 23rd. With the title World at War, it was confirmed that they were reverting back to their roots in World War II. The game was set for release in fall 2008. The game was made on an enhanced version of the COD 4 engine with emphasis on gore. This is the first COD game with real gore. This would further drive home the more serious tone of this game. Another thing that was improved upon was sound. At this time, occlusion had just been introduced to the world of gaming. This makes sound travel more realistically through the environment. Coming off the very successful COD 4, the reversion back to World War II didn't exactly sit right with players. They wanted the new, modern setting to be further explored. The game was released on November 11, 2008. The game was met with pretty positive reviews. Some reviewers said that Treyarch played it safe with this game and that it was soaked in déjà vu because of its redundant setting. However, others praised the game for its gritty, violent, and terrifying portrayal of this war. They managed to make something fresh despite going back to a horribly saturated setting. It was actually banned in Japan for a short period of time after its release because of the violence it showed against Japanese people. The multiplayer component is very similar to COD 4's. The World War II setting, however, does set the game back a bit when it comes to weapon customization. Most of the killstreak are also pretty much the same. With that out of the way, let's get into the game and see for ourselves. Already at the main menu, you get a taste of the much darker tone of this game. This haunting track plays over these destroyed landscapes. Once again, each mission starts with a briefing over some really cool visuals. This is the first COD game to portray the Pacific Theater. We get the situation. The character you play as, Private Miller, has gone MIA after landing on Makin Atoll. Roebuck, the narrator, and his boys are going to save him while raiding the island. He hints at the brutality of the Japanese by referring to rumors about how they treat their POWs. As your eyes open, you're staring at a Japanese officer. The Americans are being interrogated. This opening cutscene already hammers home the brutality of this game. Private Pyle, the other prisoner, gets his eye scorched and his throat slit. You hear him gurgle as blood splatters on the wall. Just before the same happens to you, your squad shows up and you are saved. You still have to participate in the raid, obviously. You go out to the boys where you gear up and the fight kicks off. The battle is fierce. Throughout this mission, you can find various Marines in dangerous positions that you can save. Here, the game is pretty much just easing you back into the basic COD gameplay. However, already here, the game feels more brutal than anything we've seen so far. The Japanese seemingly come out of nowhere. This makes the battle feel chaotic. That combined with the unapologetic violence makes the whole game feel raw and real. Around the map you can find half-dead soldiers suffering in their last moments. Eventually you get up to this wooden house where a burning Japanese soldier barges through the door and attacks one of your comrades. The way he screams is just haunting. You fight further along the wooden structure until you get to the jungle. In here, the battle dies down and an eerie silence swallows the night. After one of your boys go to investigate a shrine, he is blown up and you are subjected to the first of many, and I mean many, banzai charges. The Japanese emerge from the jungle and as quickly as it started, it's over. After making your way further through the jungle, you get to these Japanese positions that are holding back a support squad. You gotta help them. Once again, the battle is insanely chaotic. The Japanese move incredibly fast in this game, so it's easy to lose orientation. After that, you continue through the jungle where you find a bunch of dead Japanese soldiers. Your boys are understandably confused since no Yankers has come through here yet. Turns out to be another ambush. You get blinded and the Japanese rush you again. After this fight ends, you get to your target. You start by poking a hole in a fuel barrel and sending it down towards the Japanese base. Now you gotta go in and plant a charge in a bunker. This is the first time this game actually gets a little hard. Everything you've experienced so far with the constant Japanese charges and maneuvers is amped up. After placing the charge, you begin evacuating. But then you get jumped by a katana-wielding enemy who slices you pretty badly. You get dragged into a boat where you watch the Japanese base go up in flames. The mission ends. I really like this opening mission. It sets the tone of the game to come. You are eased into the gameplay and you get a taste of the grittiness that this game brings to the table. One thing I want to note is the Japanese. We've never fought an enemy that fights like that in any COD game so far. They rush you and move constantly and quickly. Now the amount of banzai charges are greatly over-exaggerated. In the real thing, banzai charges was a last resort. The Japanese found surrendering to be dishonorable and they would rather die. Banzai charges are basically the infantry's kamikaze. It was a suicide charge. We fast forward to the 15th of September 1944. You're about to assault Peleliu Island where you have to take an airfield. The mission starts with you exiting a boat in an amphibious vehicle. You're met with an impressive sight. Huge battleships, air superiority, and many companies moving to the beaches. We hear that the Navy has practically flattened the whole island. You expect very little, if any, resistance. You look and feel strong. That illusion is quickly shattered, however, when the supposedly few Japanese remaining open fire. The landing crafts are being picked off one by one from one of the cliffs and heavy machine gun fire is coming from the beach. Eventually, you get stuck on a coral. Another soldier peeks out of the craft and is killed along with the driver. Sullivan is shouting to drop the ramp when you get hit and blown out of the vehicle. You then have this section that's pretty reminiscent of Saving Private Ryan, where you see some soldiers get shot while underwater. Eventually, you get up on the coral. Sullivan explains that the Japanese are putting up fierce, unexpected resistance and that Plan A is out of the window. You call in a missile strike on the beach's defenders. When it's over, the Japanese machine guns fall silent, but you're still taking artillery fire. You move up to the shore and onto the island where a horrific scene awaits. The jungle has become a crater-filled, barren landscape riddled with mutilated corpses. You see dying soldiers and shell-shocked Japanese aimlessly wandering in their final moments. As a machine gun opens up again, you see how the flamethrower burns him alive inside the bunker. Another terrifying weapon. After that, you make it to the next defense line, where you're gonna have to call in some missiles again. This section also leaves you a bit shocked. Over the deafening gunfire, you can hear screams of dying soldiers. After that, you enter the trenches. After clearing them, you spot this soldier climbing a tree. This is another tactic the enemy will use. They will put snipers on palm trees. After shooting him down, you're immediately bonsai charged by camouflage soldiers. The way they fight just feels so foreign. The way they run at you with complete disregard for their own lives. After that, you get to this big bunker that you gotta strike twice with the missiles. This part is actually kinda hard. You have to get to the bunker and the Japanese will just keep coming at you over and over again. After getting into the bunker, you have this section where you gotta take out some mortar crews with a machine gun. After that, you call in some missiles on some tanks. After that, you make it to the other end of the bunker. A soldier named Polanski asks Sullivan when they can rest. Sullivan gives him an assuring soon. I want to bring this interaction up later when we get to the Soviet campaign, so just keep that in mind. Shortly after that, a Japanese soldier barges in and stabs Sullivan with a katana. As he lies there on the ground, Roebuck desperately tries to save him as the others look in defeat. The mission ends. This is really where Treyarch begins painting the ugly face of war. This mission has many horrifying moments. The Japanese have gotten more ferocious. They desperately try to push you off the island with complete disregard for their own lives. The way they fight feels foreign, almost alien. They definitely portray the extremism of the military culture in the Japanese Empire very well in this game, and also how terrifying it was to fight them because of it. First, we hear of how hard Sullivan's death was on the men. Now you gotta take the airfield and get through the Peleliu campaign. We start in the middle of a swamp. You are going around the flank. You gotta watch the foliage carefully. Eventually you encounter the wreckage of a crashed plane. Some Marines are investigating it, but it turns out to be a trap. A grenade kills the investigating Marines and the Japanese ambush. After dealing with them, you walk straight into another ambush. After dealing with them, you have arrived by the main Japanese line. You start by taking care of these artillery emplacements. You begin making your way through the Japanese line. You gotta take out bunker after bunker. It's pretty tough and really intense. Eventually you get to these machine gun positions. The flamethrower guy gets shut down. Now you gotta finish the job. As you burn the bunkers, you can hear the machine gunners scream. Right after, you're forced to go through the bunker where you can see the suffering you've inflicted. Now the road to the airfield is open. Before it comes into view, you're faced with another ambush. So far, we've been harassed non-stop. You make it out to these Marines that are currently assaulting this building. You're pinned down. You get to this truck where you get rifle grenades. These things are actually super fun. You use them to blow up MG positions. After that, you enter the ruin, where you can use the flamethrower to take care of the remaining enemies. Next, you get out onto the airfield itself. It's this huge open area that's being torn to pieces by the battle. After fighting your way up, you get to a bazooka that you have to use on these tanks. Next, you get to the airfield's main position. You enter these trench networks, where you engage in some rough and terrifying close quarters combat. The enemy fights desperately to keep the airfield, but you make it onto the position itself. After taking out the AA crews, the battle dies down, but just as you think it's over, the Japanese launches a counterattack. You have to use an AA gun to hold back the infantry and the tanks. I actually struggled with this quite a bit. It was quite hard for me, but after that, the mission is over. This is where everything we've been introduced to in the previous two missions really comes together. You have to remember the strategies that the Japanese will use on you. You gotta check the trees and be ready for them to come out of the foliage. This mission has some great moments too. Fighting through the airfield really gets your blood pumping. It was intense and hard. Using the flamethrower was also a truly horrifying experience. No simple FPS game has been able to put you face to face with the suffering you inflict on the enemy like this game does before this point in time. As horrible as the American side of things is, when I say that this is a horror game, I'm primarily referring to the Soviet missions. Here we go back to Stalingrad 1942. You play as Private Dmitry Petrenko of the 3rd Shock Army. In the intro, we hear a man named Reznov give a recap of Barbarossa. I would like you to keep Reznov's description of the Germans in mind. He says the arrogance of their leaders is matched only by the brutality of their soldiers. The mission starts with you waking up in a fountain surrounded by death. Crows are picking away at the corpses, the sky is grey and soulless, and the city is in ruins. Germans are executing the dying Soviets while tanks drive by. The tanks really adds to the soulless atmosphere. There is so much death everywhere, but the machines are still running. After the Germans leave, you begin crawling towards this soldier who is Viktor Reznov, the guy that narrated the intro. The haunting music is replaced with distant gunfire. You and Reznov crawl over to one of the cracks in the wall. Reznov asks you to take his rifle as he can no longer shoot. He explains that he has been hunting General Amsel for a while. Amsel is the bringer of suffering upon Stalingrad, according to Reznov. After his speech, you load your rifle. When the bombers mask your sound, you open fire. After taking them out, you get charged by a dog. They make a return from COD 4. After that, you close in on Amsel. You enter this tavern where Reznov gives a speech about how the city used to be full of life and now it's gone. Then he says that one day it will be Germany that will suffer like this. The Soviet side of things has much more emotional charge. While entering this building, a sniper opens fire. You rush inside and make it to the top floor. Here, while Reznov is drawing his fire, you take him out. Now you gotta move fast, cause the Germans are closing in. On the way out of the building, you get spotted by a German patrol who tries to burn you out. Then you have this tense section where you run through the burning building while taking a lot of fire. Eventually, you get out through a hole on the upper floor. After landing on the street, some Germans arrive to burn you, then your comrades show up and save you and Reznov. You notice the aftermath of a mass execution nearby, further telling the grim tale of this battle. Now you go up to cover your boys with the sniper. You have this section where you learn to blow up flamethrower dudes to take out more around them. After an intense firefight, you have to fight your way further along these buildings as the Germans begin to close in on your position. You get on the machine gun to cover the guys on the street again. You have this part where they enter the building and you gotta watch your fire so that you don't accidentally kill them. After that, you get to the square where Amsel finally emerges. After shooting him, you get swarmed. You rush through the building and jump into the Volga, where the mission ends. This is really where the game completes the picture it's trying to paint. This mission is brutal. Everything from the dead grey environment to the corpses lining the streets. It really hits you. No game has ever shown war in this light before. The visual design of this mission just feels so dead. There is practically no color and all you hear is the sounds of machines of war. They portray the industrialization of warfare very well in this game. We fast forward 3 years to April 1945. The Soviets have reached Seelau, also known as the gates to Berlin. Now we're in Germany. You wake up in a room with these Germans. When they discover that you're still alive, they line up to shoot you, but then Reznov comes to the rescue. Here you are introduced to Chernov. Chernov is sort of the voice of reason in the company. Throughout the game, you are confronted with a few choices. These choices has influence on how Chernov writes about you. This is the first one. Do you just leave the wounded Germans, which will have a positive effect, or do you execute them, which has the opposite effect? After leaving, you come out to these wheat fields where another horrifying sight awaits. The fields are being burnt, Germans are wandering around on fire, and Reznov is shouting to kill the Germans regardless of whether they're surrendering or not. Now you have Molotovs instead of grenades, and they are brutal. After fighting your way across this small river, you start ascending up this hill while the battle continues to rage. Eventually you get to this trench line where you can pick up an MG42. The LMGs in this game are absolutely brutal. They tear your enemies to pieces. You mercilessly cut your way through German after German while Reznov hypes you up. He seems to almost enjoy this. Now you gotta take out some tanks with a Panzerschreck. It's pretty hard actually. The whole battle is insanely chaotic because the Germans are basically in a mass rout right now. One last tank surprises you by this barn. Reznov lets you piggyback on the tank because he thinks you're so good at killing Germans. Eventually you arrive at a German camp. This part is fucking insane. It almost feels like you're just massacring the Germans. They are fighting back, but it's clearly no use, so there is practically no fight, only slaughter. After pushing the Germans out, you have another scene with mutilated bodies as the Soviets cheer. Reznov gets up and says that soon they will have avenged what the Germans did to them. It's very easy to notice the inversion of the roles here. In the previous mission, the Germans were extremely brutal to you and your boys, but here we're the ones showing the brutality towards them. I really like that these two missions are back to back because they raise an interesting question that we'll get to in the end. Here I want to bring Polanski and Sullivan's interaction in Little Resistance up again. Sullivan seems to really care about the lives of his men, but the only thing Reznov cares about is killing Germans. We are back in the Pacific. You've taken the airfield, but the Japanese still have a tight grip on Peleliu. You have to take out some mortar pits, and as the name suggests, you'll be using flamethrowers. You start in the trenches and use some smoke grenades to get past this pillbox. Shortly after that, you're already at the first mortar pit. The flamethrowers just burn right through them. It's pretty fucking brutal with the amount of screaming, and you're just setting so many of them alight. After that, there are 2 pits left. Moving through to the next pit is actually pretty damn hard. You go through these narrow trenches where you get rushed, and the amount of explosive barrels around makes any stray bullet even more deadly. You get shot at from trees, and the tree people can be pretty hard to locate sometimes. After burning tunnels and bunkers out, you get to the second pit. This plays out much like the last one, you just burn them. The approach to the next pit is pretty hard too. This game will occasionally nade spam the shit out of you, so when you're in a small narrow trench, it's not so easy to take cover from it. After fucking up the next mortar pit, you watch the forces march on, and the mission ends. This is probably the hardest mission so far. It's also among the scariest. The flamethrower brings such a horrible death, and the entire mission consists of you just going around and, burning them alive. That combined with the screaming and the gore makes for true nightmare fuel.
Move along the riverbed! Flank them!
Now we're going after some guns at the point. After that, the island will be firmly in American hands. We ride in on a tank where Roebuck explains the situation. You're gonna be fighting through tunnels and caves. You get ambushed and immediately thrust into the fighting. You have a Browning 1919 machine gun here, and like the MG42, it tears through the enemy. You have a tense fight through the jungle here. Eventually you get to these anti-tank guns. You get on an AA gun where you annihilate the emplacement. As you move further along the Japanese line, you can find a scope Springfield. I just love sniping in video games, so I just wanted to bring that up real quick. This part is also quite hard because once again you get stormed by quite a lot of enemies. After clearing the position, you take cover behind this flamethrower tank. It's a pretty horrifying moment. You don't really have to do anything because the tank got you. After that, you get into the cave. The cave section is pretty tense. It's dark and claustrophobic. The enemy could be hiding anywhere. Eventually, you get to the guns, which are your targets. After clearing this area, the mission is over. This was, well, a standard COD mission. I mean, it was tense, brutal, and it had that horrifying tank segment. There's not really much worth noting other than the fact that the brutality persists. This is the tank mission. You are making your way to a train station where you can get to Berlin. This mission really isn't that different from the tank missions in the previous game. You have a flamethrower here though. It has some pretty insane sections, like when you're just scorching the Germans in these small trench systems. You destroy towers and fight tanks. The bunkers are new too though. In the end, you get this cutscene where the 3rd Shock Army boards the train to Berlin. One thing I really noticed here is just how Reznov is basically just shouting propaganda at you this entire time. Now I believe that was on purpose, and we'll get to that in the end, but for now, let's move on. Also, Reznov's smile looks weird here. You arrive in Pankow, Berlin. You step out of the train and begin storming the city. You follow a tank where you soon meet the enemy. Berlin immediately poses a contrast to Stalingrad. It's during the day and the recently shelled city is still in flames. Stalingrad felt long dead, but Berlin feels like it just started dying. The fight is brutal. You move through ruins as the Germans shoot at you with rocket launchers and a big small arms arsenal. The Soviet tanks aren't doing so well either. This part is actually pretty hard. It's almost right after exiting the train. You're shooting across the street to the opposite buildings while the Germans put up a fierce defense. After going through this building, you hear Germans being executed en masse. If you remember, we saw the Germans doing this to the Soviets in Stalingrad. It's very clear that Berlin is gonna be an inversion of the experiences that the different sides had. Right after that, you engage these Germans in this park. After fighting your way through, you get into this asylum, which was evidently used for some pretty horrible crimes against humanity. The building itself is dark and looks like something out of a horror movie. It's as if the building is echoing the horrors that took place in there. The horrible silence is quickly replaced with the horrible noise of combat. The fight in there is, like so many other moments in this game, very brutal. When you get out again, you follow another tank up the street where the Germans are in the middle of a mass rout. A commissar is telling the Germans to abandon everything as well as their hope. The mission ends. To me, the commissar's last lines are to really hammer home the fact that this enraged horde that is the Soviet army is about to enact its revenge. Revenge is a strong theme in the Soviet campaign. We'll get into that in the end, where I can kinda pack everything together. By making Berlin an inversion of Stalingrad, they really complement the theme of revenge and the moral questions that it brings. The Soviet grip on Berlin tightens as the Germans get even more desperate. Berlin is looking more and more like Stalingrad. As you spawn in, you find this German soldier who's begging for his life as he's held at gunpoint. A Soviet soldier tries to reason with another about keeping him alive, but the German is executed. After that, Chernov says that it isn't war, just murder. As you get out onto the roof, you are met with a blackened sky as rockets rain down, tearing the city apart. You sneak up on these Germans when entering the next building. You quickly clear the room. The building crumbles as you tear your way through. Eventually you get to this place where you save your comrade just in time. Eventually you get to this square. I really struggled with this. The rocket launchers return accompanied by a swarm of Germans. After fighting through the building, you get back out on the street. When you get out, you see the state of Berlin. It was already bad in the previous mission, but now it's just a mangled corpse of a city. Here my favorite track on the score plays. I really want to take a moment to talk about the music. It almost feels like a constant battle between the classical clean sound and industrial guitars and synths. It fits very well in a game that has such a brutal depiction of industrial warfare. Like how human nature mixed with these murder machines of war become something truly destructive. You get to another of the Chernov choices. Granted, many has passed that I haven't mentioned, but they're not as in your face as this and the one in the beginning of Their Land, Their Blood. Here 3 Germans are surrendering. You can either let the other Russians burn them or mercy kill them by mowing them down. After that, you enter the tunnels. Here I got the glitch. This mission has a bug where Reznov will just stay by the entrance and won't go down, so you can't progress. I tried everything to fix it, but my only option was to restart the mission and just hope it works. I'll just quickly tell you what happens. You fight till the end of the metro where the tunnels get flooded before you can make it out. This mission has many horrifying moments, from watching POWs get executed to watching the rockets destroy Berlin. This mission is definitely the one that makes the message most clear.
Risky. Should we abort? Negative. We can do this. Engine number.
Now we're back with the Americans, but you're not Private Miller this time, you're Locke, a gunner on a Catalina. Now the American campaign goes to April 1945. You're clearing the way to Okinawa. This is kinda like the bomber mission in United Offensive. Here, however, it's completely on rail. You'll be switching between different gunner positions. Your first target is a convoy moving to Okinawa. This part is pretty easy, you just make some passes while blowing up the ships. However, PT boats show up. The battle escalates a bit, but you keep pounding the ships. After sinking the ships, the battle dies down a bit. As you begin making your way back, you get a distress call from a fleet heading to Okinawa. Now you gotta go save them. Japanese Zeros make their way into the arena, and now the battle is gonna get really hectic. Eventually your buddies in another plane get shot down. When you arrive by the fleet, it's under a very vicious attack. Zeros rain hell with munitions and kamikaze. Eventually you get to this part where you land on the water. You gotta hold back the PT boats while rescuing sailors from the water. Eventually friendly fighters show up and you make your way back. The mission ends. This was a cool mission. Granted, all you do is shoot down fighters, but the spectacle is so eye-gluing. It also feels like a nice throwback to United Offensive's bomber mission. There's not really much more to say here. Now we're playing as Private Miller again, and we're on Okinawa. The harsh conditions has caused the American morale to suffer. As the level starts, you look at an artillery barrage in the distance. This level looks quite different from the previous missions in the Pacific. It's dark, overcast, and heavy rain dominates the scenery. As the fighting picks up, you're introduced to spider holes, which is a tunnel system with various holes where soldiers can pop up and shoot from. In this mission, you have both the flamethrower and an LMG, which are like the two most brutal weapons in the game. You're either burning them alive or tearing them apart. Eventually, you approach this MG position where you gotta use smoke to advance. Right after that, you enter one of the cave systems. The fight is brutal, but you make it through. On the other side, you are introduced to this mission's shtick. You gotta put a satchel charge in 3 bunkers to blow them up. It pretty much kills everyone inside. This whole part is actually pretty hard. Roebuck keeps stressing that you blow up the bunker while 10 enemies are nade spamming you. It really stresses you out. After blowing up the bunkers, you gotta go through this tunnel system. Here it gets even harder. There are so many enemies in here and almost every piece of cover can be easily penetrated. On the other side, the mission ends. Visually, this mission is much closer to the Soviet missions than the other in the Pacific. Instead of the lively jungles, we get a dark, violent, tropical depression. The viciousness of the weather actually adds to the impact that the violence has. It's more disgusting, if that makes sense.
Watch out for more!
Right off the bat, the stakes are made clear. The Japanese are making their last stand at Shuri Castle, and now you gotta go take it. You start off with an empty rifle. You gotta go get some supplies by the drop. The fight picks up suddenly after getting to the supply drop. You get into cover as mortars begin raining hell. Their fire is being directed by spotters in the tunnels. You gotta get in there and take them out. You sneak up on this squad. The fight is pretty much over as soon as it started. A whole squad wiped in seconds. You get out on the other side. You're immediately pummeled with another banzai charge. Now you're advancing on the castle itself. The advance to the castle is one of the hardest parts in the game. The Japanese are relentless. It really feels like they are making their last stand. Eventually you get to the mortar positions. Here you can pick up mortar shells, prime them and throw them at the enemy. It's like a really powerful impact grenade. Fighting through the castle court is another super hard section. The violence on display in this mission really leaves an impression on you even after the past hours of gameplay. After pushing through the castle, you get to another tunnel system. This mission does not give you any breaks at all. It's constant fighting pretty much. You get back out into the courtyard where you find some surrendering enemies. While trying to arrest them, they suddenly charge up and Roebuck gets killed by a suicide grenade. Now you get the last charge of the Japanese. You have to call in airstrikes on various parts of the castle while you get charged over and over again. Although it's a tough section, I didn't really find it to be as hard as the section prior to it. After that, the mission is over and so is the American campaign. This mission is a constant barrage of action, not one silent moment. It's a good end to Private Miller's story. The enemies are at their last stand and they are desperate to push you back. We're back with Reznov and Petrenko. They just got out of the metro and now you gotta make your way to the Reichstag. Shortly after that, you get this moment where Chernov is writing in his diary and Reznov catches him and scolds him for it.
Which do you think will lead us home? Writing about this war or fighting it? Germany in the blood. No one will ever read this!
Like the previous mission, you're immediately thrust into battle. You get through these ruins and then you get to the Reichstag. Now you have to approach it. Forget what I said about Shuri Castle, this is the hardest part of the game. During your crossing of the plaza, you get hammered with artillery, machine guns and rocket launchers. First you gotta run across the whole place to take out some 88s. Already here I was dying a lot. Eventually you get to the last stretch before reaching the Reichstag. Here it gets even harder. This whole mission is honestly terrifying. The ruins of Berlin with the blackened skies and roaring of the battle really sells this feeling that this is the end. After making it to the stairs and fighting for every inch to the doors of the Reichstag, you get to the last set where our voice of reason, Chernov, gets killed by a guy with a flamethrower. Reznov gets up to his body, grabs his journal and says,
Someone should lead us.
It seems that with his dying breath, Chernov proved to Reznov that he indeed has the heart of a warrior. After that, you get into the Reichstag and the mission ends. This is probably the most impactful mission in the game. You basically have the finish line in sight, but you have to fight for every inch to get there. It's truly horrifying how intense this battle was. It leaves you kinda exhausted afterwards. There is still one more mission though. In the beginning you hear what Chernov wrote about you in his journal. If you were moral, he writes well about you. If you were in between, he simply says that he doesn't understand you, and if you were amoral, his words are less than favorable. Now you fight through the Reichstag. You tear your way through the remaining Germans as you make your way to the roof. There's really not a lot to say about the mission itself, other than it's close to being just as hard as the previous. What really makes this mission stand out is the end. When you get to the roof, you can pick up the Soviet flag, but as you make your way to where you can plant it, you get shot by this German hiding behind a wall. Reznov completely butchers him with his cleaver sword and helps you up. Then you plant your flag on the Reichstag and it waves over Berlin. After that you get a short speech where we get a recap of the end of the Pacific Theater. We see the nukes get dropped on Japan. After this, after everything you've been through, the horrors you've seen, the horrors you've inflicted, what are you left with? A parade of heroes, a celebration of bravery, or a prideful speech? No. All you're met with is this screen that says 60 million lives were lost as a result of World War II. It was the most destructive and deadly conflict in human history. It really makes you think about everything that has happened over the course of the game. How unnecessary a lot of the deaths were. This ending is insanely unsatisfying, but that's why it's so fucking good. Despite the game's inaccuracies, it's things like that that does the history justice. After that, the credits roll and the game is over. Or is it? You didn't think I was gonna forget about zombies, eh? You cannot talk about this game without bringing up the zombies mode. This seemingly random and completely out of left field game mode would become a staple of the COD franchise. Some people buy these games solely for the zombies mode. In this game mode, you basically just stand your ground against waves and waves of zombies trying to get through to the highest number of rounds as possible. You start with a simple pistol, but by earning points you can buy new weapons and unlock new areas. It's very simple but great fun. The creation of this mode began when Treyarch planned to have a post-credit horde mode where you played as a German defending Omaha Beach. Higher-ups came to the conclusion that this idea was a bit too edgy. In a game that features such a brutal depiction of war, they felt that it would be a bit too far. The idea was scrapped and laid to rest. But some of the developers at Treyarch took the premise home and toyed with it a bit. That was when the zombies come in. This was completely unapproved and hidden from the rest of the team. The devs that knew about it had gotten completely addicted. Every day they would come in and try to beat each other's high scores. Eventually the higher-ups found out and they simply went, "What?" They were trying to make a gritty, real and serious depiction of World War II, so there was absolutely no way they were gonna include it. But then they tried it and became just as addicted to it as the other developers. They then made the bold decision to include it. They wanted players to try it, so they put it in the game. But it was to be kept completely hidden from the public. There was no marketing done and you wouldn't even find out it existed unless you beat the campaign. The reason for this is that they wanted players to go through the whole thing before trying it. On release, it featured a single map, which was Nach der Untoten. It was basically just a bunker from Hard Landing put in a scary night setting and reworked a bit to fit the mode. It had only one unique mechanic, which was the mystery box. There is no doubt that the secrecy contributed to its success. Over the next 9 months, the game would receive 3 map packs that each included a new zombies map. Instead of just being the same thing as Nach der Untoten, they expanded on the formula with each release. By the end, the zombies mode was pretty much a standalone experience. The first of these extra maps to come out was Verrückt. It introduced a power mechanic where you had to activate the power to be able to unlock certain areas. It could also be used for these zapper traps. But the most notable addition was the perks. You also had to activate the power to get this. You can go up to these machines that grant you a drink, which will give you some pretty insane buffs. The characters got voice lines and the mystery box would disappear and reappear in random spots. This map alone completely overhauled and improved the zombies experience. The next map, Shinonuma, brought even more innovation with enemy variety and randomized perk spawns. But the next map is really what takes it to the next level. This map was Der Riese. Der Riese almost feels like an entirely different game. It brings a unique atmosphere, introduces us to teleportation and pack-a-punch, but most importantly, it's the first map to feature a hidden questline. You just have to follow some simple steps and you get to watch these floating orbs fly away. These little Easter eggs would become a staple of this game mode. The Zombies mode is one of the components that make Call of Duty today. And to think that it was almost completely scrapped and is basically just the result of some devs fucking around is pretty wild. Call of Duty World at War is one heck of a ride from start to finish. It goes back to the World War II setting, but it explores a part of the war that they haven't previously touched, that being the horror of it. This game is terrifying. Previous shooters had barely any blood, but here severed limbs fly through the air, you hear the screams of dying soldiers, and see the scorched corpses of soldiers that has been burned alive. It really is a game that you won't forget. Not because its gameplay is super interesting, it's just standard COD gameplay, but because its look and aesthetic really rocks you to your core. It's hard to wrap your head around that we actually do this to each other. That's why this game is so impactful. It gives you a very real taste of the horrors of war. A taste that video games previously have been unable to provide. In the game, you switch between Private Miller in the Pacific and Private Petrenko in Germany. It's when I compared these two perspectives that I noticed something pretty interesting. In the Pacific, you fight an enemy that uses unconventional tactics that none of the characters are really ready for. You have to watch the trees, listen for the bonsai scream, and watch out for ambushes. The enemy is extreme in their belief, and they don't care if they die. In the Soviet campaign, you fight a well-organized enemy that uses conventional tactics. But then if you look back at yourself, you have Reznov shouting propaganda and soldiers showing absolutely no mercy. In the American part, you're fighting the extreme. In the Soviet, you are that extreme. The Soviet perspective also raises an interesting question. Does what the Germans did in Stalingrad justify what you do in Berlin? Well, obviously no. This game shows that in war, everyone, regardless of which side they're on, is capable of true evil. With all that said, I think it's safe to conclude that despite some head-scratching inaccuracies and some over-the-top moments, this game remains a top runner for most true depiction of World War II in any media. Where this game cements itself in the COD formula is with the introduction of zombies. Zombies would quickly become a cornerstone for Treyarch's games, and shortly thereafter, the franchise as a whole. It features 4 maps that each gives a unique spin on the very bare-bones zombies formula. The simplicity combined with the constant innovation and the secrecy surrounding the game mode was the recipe that made zombies a huge success. Call of Duty World at War remains one of my favorite games of all time to this day. Anyways, I've got some plants to water, so see you next time.